Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my first class, Foundations of Astrology, the Thema Mundi. We're going to be exploring the birth chart of the cosmos. My name is Sean Klinkner. I am the founder of WisdomTree Astrology and a practicing astrologer, and I'm delighted that you've joined me today. For the next hour, we are going to be taking a tour through an ancient teaching tool known as the Thema Mundi. That was a tool used by ancient astrologers to teach their students some of the foundational concepts behind Hellenistic astrology. And so there's going to be a lot to learn today. I think it's going to be really fun, really easy to pick up some of these concepts. There will be a time for Q&A at the end, and I would just invite you to get comfortable and listen in and save your questions for the end, and we'll get started. All right. So one of the first things that I want to do today is just make some acknowledgments. Like many art disciplines or religious practices, wisdom traditions, astrology is a practice that is thousands of years old and has been passed down from teacher to student. And it's very much a practice that I feel like is best held through apprenticeship. And here's where I really want to offer some gratitude to two of my favorite teachers, and to acknowledge that I'm a part of a lineage of astrologers. And these individuals, Adam Ellenboss of Nightlight Astrology and Michelle Corbisser of Michelle's Midheaven, have both had important roles in training me as a Hellenistic astrologer. And I'm very grateful for their time, their intention, the encouragement that they've given me in my practice. And I just wanted to take some time and acknowledge the role that both of these two mentors have had for me. So these are the things that we're going to be covering today in our class. On the Thema Mundi, we're going to talk a little bit about the natural symbolism that is inherent in ancient astrology. We're going to talk about what is the Thema Mundi. I'm going to introduce something called the Chaldean order and help all of you understand how that relates to the speed of the planets and why that's important. We're going to use the Thema Mundi to help anchor us in some very basic concepts around what is planetary dignity. And if you're not even sure what that even sounds like, that's okay, because I'm going to explain what planetary dignity is. We're also going to explain and explore some things related to planetary contrariety. And then we'll talk about the four classical aspects and kind of the why behind the aspects. And then we'll have some Q&A. So settle in and let's enjoy our tour today through the cosmos. So one of the first things that I want everyone to connect with, and I think this is one of the most magical things about astrology, is that not only has astrology been around for thousands of years, even, some of the earliest human civilizations had practices where they looked up at the skies and they studied the stars. They not only used them for navigation and wayfaring, but celestial events had spiritual meanings, and they would pay attention to those things and they would document, the meanings around those. They viewed celestial events as omens, and the same is very true when it comes to astrology. Ancient Hellenistic astrologers derived the meaning of the planets and the stars based on their ability to view these astronomical realities. Where these observations came from was the patterns and cycles of the sun and moon, the movement of the 7 planets, which were called the wandering stars, because when they would look up at the night sky, they would see the fixed stars, those stars which stayed in place. And then there were these stars that moved in a different direction. And over time, they began to discern that these weren't just stars, these were actual planets. Also, there are a lot of meanings that are ascribed to the planets and the signs based on the quality of light, the astronomical seasons that we practice as marked by the solstices, the summer and winter solstice, and also the spring and fall equinox, the midpoints, and also the 4 elements, the times of year that were cold and dry or cold and wet, or warm and wet and warm and dry. All of these different kinds of things play into natural symbolism that is very important and inherent in astrology. This natural symbolism became the foundation for concepts supporting our understanding of the symbolic meaning and interpretation of planetary natures, what the planets were omens of, and also the 4 points that comprise the natal chart, the 12 houses of astrology, and the 12 signs of the zodiac. One of the first examples that we have of this was an ancient diagram illustrating planetary speed called the Thema Mundi, or the Chaldean order. This here, where you can see my mouse, is the Chaldean order. And the Chaldean order wasn't necessarily astronomically correct in the sense of the position of the planets in their proximity to the sun. So we all know that when we look at space and we look at the order of the planets, the sun is out there, and then Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. But if we look here on um, the Chaldean order, we'll see that the Earth is here in the center, then the moon, then Mercury, then Venus. The sun is in the center, then Mars, then Jupiter, and Saturn. And then out here we have the fixed stars in the firmament. And then out here was known as sort of the divine one God. So what is it then that this Chaldean order is actually pointing to if it's not pointing to the astronomical location of the planets? Well, the answer is that this diagram was actually used to explain planetary speed. So first of all, this diagram is Earth-centric. With Earth here in the middle, there was something that ancient astrologers were trying to explain or to give perspective that this is from the perspective of the Earth. That was known as an Earth-centric or geocentric point of view. When we progress out through the spheres, the very first planetary body that we come to is the moon. And the moon was the fastest of all of the heavenly bodies because she would travel around the earth and she would cover all 12 zodiac signs in a month, which was the fastest of all the planets. Mercury was second in its speed, which is why Mercury is here in the second sphere. Venus was third, and then the sun. The 5th fastest was Mars, then Jupiter, and then finally Saturn is the slowest planet. So what's really important here is not only thinking about the planetary speed with the Chaldean order, but it was also, there's something about the position of these planets and their relationship to one another that was indicative of their cycles. So for example, the position of the sun separated the inferior planets from the superior planets. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, inferior wasn't necessarily an indication of less powerful. It only had to do with the fact that these planets were faster than the sun. The superior planets were all those planets that were slower than the sun. And so, how this relates to planetary cycles is that the moon, Mercury, and Venus, because they were faster than their sun, their cycles with the sun were derived from when they would, in their speed, catch up to the sun, enter into a conjunction with the sun, and then move through the cycle until they came to the next conjunction. And that cycle was unique to the inferior planets because they were faster than the sun. For all of the superior planets who are slower than the sun, it was about the sun moving through its position and how the sun came into contact with the superior planets who were slower to move through the cycles. And there's a whole lot to be learned and understood about planetary cycles that I'm not going to go into today, but I just wanted to lay this foundational understanding about the Chaldean order because we're going to see it play a role in the Thema Mundi. And so just tuck that away in your mind for just a short minute, and then we'll come back to it. So, like I mentioned, the Chaldean order was developed based on the observation of the wandering stars. These stars that were actually planets. They moved in the sky in a different direction than the rest of the fixed stars. Also, it's important to note that when the ancient astrologers looked up in the sky, they only beheld the 7 traditional planets, which is why Hellenistic astrology focuses on the primary 7 planets: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto weren't visible to the natural eye. They were too small. And so all of Hellenistic astrology formed within the concepts of what was naturally visible to the naked human eye. So one of the things that I get asked a lot by people is how do you handle Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? And the reality is that the original 7 planets and the meanings that are often ascribed to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are captured within the dynamics of the original 7 planets. You can find those meanings and significations embedded within the original 7 planets. Modern astrology has actually gone through and changed some of the planetary rulerships and all of those things, and we aren't going to get into that today, but I want everyone to know that there was a completeness within the original system of astrology with the 7 planets. And I still use Uranus and Neptune and Pluto in my practice. But I don't treat them as rulers of the signs in the way that some modern astrologers do. So coming back to the Chaldean order, the moon was closest to the earth, and therefore, you can see the moon right here. The moon was seen as the gateway of mankind. And so the way that that was kind of envisioned was the moon and the sun were the most important planets. They were the luminaries. One ruled the daytime and one ruled the nighttime. And the moon, having no light of her own, would always carry the light of the sun. And that was a picture of the masculine and the feminine in their relationship with one another, and the moon kind of giving birth to life on earth. And so the gateway of mankind was the idea that the moon was the administrator of light, of the sun, the light of spirit, and translating that here into the earthly sphere, into all incarnate life. That's why it was known. That's why the moon and her sign of Cancer was known as the gateway of mankind. Similarly, if we move up the Chaldean order to the place of Saturn, Saturn was the place that was the furthest out in the visible universe. Where Saturn dwelled was closest to the fixed stars. The fixed stars and out beyond lie the place of the divine being, the one God. And so it was seen as that Saturn was the gateway to the gods. Saturn's domain was the last place before that divine realm of the things that didn't change, whereas the planets would move. And so they were the wandering stars. They were the ones that would shift and move with the cycles with the sun. Out beyond that, everything was fixed. And that was a picture of divinity. So we're going to see some of that oppositional dynamic between the moon being the gateway to mankind and being closest to the earth, and Saturn being farthest out and closest to the gateway to the gods play out a little bit later when we study some things with the birth chart of the cosmos. And if you think about it, if the sun is the place where life incarnates, it makes sense then why Saturn was associated with death and the transition of the spirit of man out into the realms beyond. So a little bit of storytelling there. And so hold on to that because we're going to see that contrast show up again as we get into the Thema Mundi. All right, so here we are. We've arrived at our teaching tool, the Thema Mundi. So the Thema Mundi is the mythical birth chart of the cosmos. And like I said, this was a teaching tool that ancient astrologers used to teach their students some of the core concepts around astrology. And the Latin translation of the Thema Mundi is from the Greek was cosmogenesis, or the nativity of the cosmos. And what you will see here is at the time of, and this is the lore behind the Thema Mundi, is you will see that in this chart, all the planets are arranged here in a very particular order in their signs. So the moon is on the ascendant. The ascendant, remember, in astrology, the ascendant is the sign that was on the horizon at the time of birth. And so if we're talking about the nativity of the cosmos, Cancer and its sign, the sign of the moon, was on the ascendant, indicating the time of incarnation. Next was the sun in its sign of Leo, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in her sign of Libra, Mars in his sign of Scorpio, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and lastly, Saturn in Capricorn. So like I mentioned just a moment ago, the sun and the moon are the most important planets in astrology. They are the luminaries. They are the givers of light and life. They were considered the king and the queen. And one ruled the daytime, the sun, and one ruled the night, the moon. One was much more powerful in daytime charts. One was more powerful in nighttime charts. And while we're not going to do an exploration of day and nighttime charts today, just remember that there was an important recognition of each of these lights as being significant in the natal chart. Now, each of the luminaries ruled only one sign. The moon only ruled Cancer. The sun only ruled Leo. The rest of the planets, however, were assigned their signs in zodiacal order based on, guess what? Planetary speed. So if we remember back to the Chaldean order and the speed of the planets, all of a sudden things are sinking into place. Let's start with Mercury. So here we have the sun and the moon. The next fastest planet was Mercury. Mercury ruled Virgo and Gemini. So we have the next two signs adjacent to the sun and moon belong to Mercury. Then Venus was the next fastest planet. And so Venus ruled the next two signs, Libra and Taurus. Then Mars, who ruled Scorpio and Aries. Then we get to Jupiter, who ruled Sagittarius and Pisces. And lastly, at the far edge of the Thema Mundi, we have the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, which were ruled by Saturn. Now, it's important to note here that each one of the other planets, from Mercury to Saturn, had rulership over one masculine sign and one feminine sign. Now, you might ask, well, why didn't the sun and the moon have each a sign to rule? Well, or two signs to rule. Well, it's because they were considered the two luminaries. And so, because the moon had no light of her own, she was the feminine representation of the light. The sun was the masculine representation of the light. And together they ruled the two signs, and that's how we now have the 12 signs of the zodiac. There was another really fun mythological story, though, about the Thema Mundi that I think is quite cute. And it bears telling because I think it's a fun way to think about the Thema Mundi. And this came about later in Persian astrology, where the myth of the Thema Mundi becomes a little bit more fun, maybe childlike a little bit. But the way that it was described is that all the planets began in their temples down here, just like we just walked through. But as the sun began to move from the time that the cosmos began into its cycle, it began moving through the signs. And as it moved, Mercury saw the sun coming towards his house, and he didn't want to get burned up. So Mercury fled from the sun and ran to his house in Gemini. Then Venus saw that the sun was coming for her, and she didn't want to get burned up by the sun. And so she packed her bags and she fled to her home in Taurus. Likewise, Mars was in watery Scorpio and saw that the sun was coming for his house next. Mars fled to Aries, his alternate home. Jupiter retreated from Sagittarius into Pisces. And lastly, poor Saturn, who was the slowest remaining planet, could not escape very far or very quickly from the sun. In fact, Saturn could only move one more sign away from the sun into Aquarius. And so it was that when the sun caught up to Saturn, the heat of the sun's beams came upon him and burnt Saturn and turned him black. And that was a part of the mythology of why Saturn was known as a planet that was ruddy and dark in complexion, and people who had dark or who had Saturn placements often had dark hair color and ruddy skin. And there's a whole bunch of things related to physical astrology that we're not going to get into. But I just love this story because it just sort of animates things and puts it into perspective. And it's just a fun way to remember about the planets and how they came to rule their certain signs. And it also tells us something about the nature of the sun and what planets experience as the sun gets close to them. They don't want to be burnt up. And there actually is something in the cycles of the planets that when planets get close to the sun, they disappear from sight. So if you look up into the sky, when a planet gets within a certain number of degrees of the sun, it can't be seen anymore. It becomes invisible because the light of the sun is so great. When the sun gets and a planet gets within 8 degrees of the sun, it becomes combust. And that is a process that astrological interpreters look at as something that feels really deeply painful or uncomfortable to the planet. And then there's the moment where they come into conjunction with the sun, and that was a moment called Cazimi. So I won't go into more of the planetary cycles with the sun, but it's interesting to me that even in the Thema Mundi, when the ancient astrologers describe the pathway of the sun and the planets moving into their alternate domiciles, that there was this perception of we've got to run away from the sun. We don't want to be burnt up. And that concept is actually a little bit inherent in the planetary cycles. So stay tuned for another class on planetary cycles. So I think it's next, as we look at the Thema Mundi, it's important for us to talk about the very basics of planetary dignity. The Thema Mundi provides us with this context of the planets in their home signs. And the home signs of planets were where they experienced kind of their most natural state. So just like when you and I are at home, we are sleeping in our own beds. We have access to all of our money, all of our favorite things, our favorite furniture, our favorite blankets, our favorite snacks. We are at our most relaxed and natural selves when we are in our own home. It is also true for the planets. So as we think about Mercury in its home in Virgo and Gemini, Mercury is going to be most relaxed in those two signs, its most natural self. When Mars is in Scorpio and Aries, the same is true. So this begins to lay the groundwork for us to understand when planets were most themselves and most well positioned to deliver on their natal promises. When they were not at home, that is another kind of condition, and we'll walk through that in just a moment. In ancient times, when somebody came and visited your home, hospitality was seen as something that was of the utmost importance. During a time where a guest stayed at your home, it was strongly considered to be a powerful commitment to protect your guest. Their welfare was in your hands. The homeowner that the guest was staying with had the obligation to provide for their guest, to provide for their food, a place of rest and protection, and to help take care of their needs. Hospitality was very important in ancient times. This metaphor actually transcended into astrology and carried forward into early astrology concepts. When a planet was not in one of its home signs, like we just reviewed with the Thema Mundi, it was staying in the house of another planet. The guest planet, therefore, had the obligation to provide resources to its guest. And that was depicting a relationship between the two planets and how the guest planet had the ability to either fulfill its promises easily in a natal chart and in the native's life, or perhaps a little bit more difficult time with delivering on its promises. The Thema Mundi, therefore, provided context for when a planet was at home or when it was the guest of another planet. So you might think about this way. I want you to imagine that you've just got a huge tax return and you are overflowing with money. And one of your friends comes to visit with you. Do you think that you're going to be in a better position to be able to support and provide for them because of this access to special resources? Yeah, of course. You're gonna go out to eat. You're gonna feel like, woohoo, I've got all this extra money that I didn't anticipate. And you're going to share that to some degree with your guest. Um, Now imagine that the opposite's true. Imagine that you have a friend coming to stay, and then all of a sudden your furnace quits working, and you're having to dig deep into your emergency fund and cover some major renovations, and then all of a sudden your dishwasher breaks, and you're having to fix that, and then you get in a car accident. These kinds of things are kind of like when a planet's in a bad place and it has a guest. If you think that your job is to provide well for someone when they're staying with you and you've got some bad circumstances, how well do you think that you'll be able to provide for your guest? Do you think you're going to be doing the same things that you would be otherwise? Probably not. It's going to be a little bit more bare bones. That was a picture of how we would think about planetary dignity and the guest host relationship in a natal chart. We're not going to get too far into that today, but it's an important concept to think about as it relates to the Thema Mundi and when a planet is in its home sign and when it's well resourced versus when it's the guest of another planet. And when it's the guest of another planet, where is that planet? Is it in one of its home signs or is it the guest of another planet? All of these things play into how we interpret a natal chart. So the next thing that the Thema Mundi was used to help anchor students in was ideas about the basic natures of the planets. So now that we understand where the planets are the most comfortable or have the most dignity, which is a term we use a lot in astrology, let's now examine circumstances where planets are very challenged. This was known as being in a place of detriment or exile. The idea was that in certain signs, planets were the furthest away from their natural home, and then therefore they experienced more difficulty and discomfort. We're going to start with the signs of the sun and the moon, which should opposite the signs of Saturn, the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. So with the sun and moon being opposite Saturn in the Thema Mundi, the signs of the light are Cancer and Leo that occur during the height of the summer season. So Cancer is the sign that's in rulership during the time of the summer solstice, when the sun reaches its peak in the sky and the days are long and it is warm, it is bright, the days feel longer. And Leo, the sign of the sun, is the time that follows that, where the days are still long and the heat of summer's here, and it's like one of the brightest and best times of the year. Similarly, the signs of Saturn, Capricorn and Aquarius, are the exact opposite. So they occur at the darkest time of the year, when the night is the longest, when the days are the coldest. This is where you can't escape the reality that ancient astrologers understood the signs and their relationship to the seasons and the quality of light. So just like the moon is in rulership in Cancer season at the height of the summer solstice, we find Saturn in his rule at the time of the winter solstice, the darkest and shortest day of the year. This juxtaposition of light and darkness was seen as oppositional. And that is why Saturn was called the Lord of the Opposition, because Saturn resided in the furthest part of the galaxy opposite of the sun and the moon. Saturn ruled the dark, the sun and moon ruled the light. So for this reason, the moon is at home in her sign of Cancer. But if we go opposite the moon to the sign of Capricorn, she was in exile in Capricorn. Similarly, the sun, who is at home in Leo, if we go opposite to Leo, if the sun is in Aquarius, the sun is in exile in Aquarius. If Saturn is in the signs of the sun or the moon, Saturn is in exile. And that is where it's important for us to come back to this idea of being at home or being far away. A lot of people, when they hear the words detriment or exile, it kind of feels spooky because we don't know how big of a problem we have, right? There's a lot of things that can influence a planet's ability to be successful when it's not at home. And we're not going to cover all of that today. What's most important to pay attention here is a planet at home or is it far away? Is it in exile? There's something about the nature of the place of the sun and moon that is bright, that is full of life, that is teeming with busyness and incarnation, that is very opposite to the nature of Saturn. Saturn dwelled in a dark place. That's where we get understandings that part of what Saturn represents is perspective, kind of isolation from the rest of society, spirituality, being closest to the realm of the gods. All of these things were associated with Saturn. It's important here to note too that in the context of light and dark, we are not conflating those with good and evil. Okay. Light and dark were qualities of, in ancient astrology, were qualities of illumination. They were related to the seasons. They were also related to masculinity and femininity. And so it's important that we not characterize Saturn in a way that is only like difficult or evil. There were many positive things that Saturn could be related to, but he was known as a malefic planet. And that was partly because he sits opposite of the sun and moon. And that oppositional quality was something that defined Saturn, something that was kind of a stalemate between the light and the dark, two equal forces that were opposed to one another. So we will come back to that in a little bit, but this is important for us to understand because it's this dynamic that helps us learn a little bit about how the ancient astrologers took natural phenomenon and natural things that they would observe during the time of the year, and also the difference in relationship to planetary speed and location in the sky, and they associated it with those planets. This is why I love ancient astrology, is because there's a quality to it that just is like common sense. It makes you go, oh, I didn't realize it was just simple like that. I mean, there's a lot of things that about astrology that are complicated, but this kind of takes it back to a very basic, kind of easier to remember way of thinking about the signs and the planets that rule them and some of the things about their core nature. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about some of the other planetary contrarieties. Just like the sun and the moon sat opposite Saturn, the signs of Mercury, Gemini, and Virgo sit opposite the signs of Jupiter, Pisces, and Sagittarius. So what can we learn about this? Well, like I said, opposition doesn't mean enemies. It just means that they are very different. They are fundamentally very different from one another. They're more uncomfortable. in each other's signs. So let's explore a little bit why. Mercury was associated with reason. It was associated with planning, intellect, critical thinking. Its base nature was to take things apart, to deconstruct ideas and thoughts, to simplify, to sometimes disagree or dissent, or to offer another perspective. Mercury was seen as someone who introduced chaos sometimes into things or destabilized things, and then would sometimes put things back together. So let's pause for a moment. What is one famous kind of time of year that we talk about all the time that is related to Mercury? You've got it. Mercury retrograde. And what happens during Mercury retrograde? Mercury starts from its regular motion, begins to move backwards. And what do people associate with that? People associate that with chaos, chaos with technology, strange things, happening in their world, coming up for kind of review and reflection. Things don't move forward quite as easily. Can you see a little bit about that? Because Mercury goes through retrograde more often than all of the other planets. Well, we can see that here in Mercury's base nature. Mercury's base nature was to break things down. That was like a picture of when the planet would move into retrograde. It was a deconstructing process, a time of critical review and thinking, a time, it symbolized Mercury's sometimes contrariness. Like it reminds you of a classroom situation with a teacher and a student, and the teacher's trying to teach a concept and the student's pulling out, but what about this, teacher? And they bring up some fact that's kind of contrary, or they're pointing holes in somebody's argument. That was sort of like Mercury. Mercury was fast, agile, it was a powerful thinking planet. And so, because of that, we get some of these ideas from Mercury's cycle. Now let's think about Jupiter. Jupiter's base nature was associated with faith, principles, and belief. Unlike Mercury, who likes to deconstruct things and is more rational and logical, Jupiter is more subjective, aspirational, positive, maybe like overly positive or encouraging. Jupiter's base nature was to increase, to grow, to bring together, to accumulate things. Like Jupiter loves abundance. Mercury, there's a point at which abundance is good, but then there's a point at which abundance is too much. And so Mercury thinks that it's illogical to have all this stuff. And Mercury wants to simplify. Mercury wants to break down. Mercury wants to go minimalist and keep things simple. Jupiter is the opposite. Jupiter loves to accumulate. Jupiter loves to grow. It loves to agree. It loves to make things stable and coherent and to bring order. So this is perhaps one of the planetary contrarieties that is harder for people to understand. It's why I'm spending a little bit more time to try and illuminate a little bit of the differences between Mercury and Jupiter, but they were fundamentally uncomfortable in each other's worlds and signs. And it's important to recognize that, because you'll hear from time to time, like right now, Jupiter is actually moving through Mercury's sign of Gemini right now in the transiting planets. So what's interesting about that is Jupiter is staying in Mercury's house in Gemini, which means it's fundamentally uncomfortable. What's also really interesting is Mercury is transiting through Pisces right now, which means that Mercury is staying in Jupiter's house. I won't go into this long, but we have two planets who are both considered in exile or uncomfortable. This establishes when two planets are staying in one another's houses, it's like they've exchanged places. This is a condition that ancient astrologers called mutual reception. And when planets were in mutual reception with one another, it was like me saying to you, here, I'm going to stay at your house for a while, and here's where all the goodies are. Here's where my secret stash of cash is, and here's where I hide an extra key under the doormat in case you ever, forget the key to the house and get locked out. It's like I give you the authority and I tell you where the good stuff is. And similarly, you do the same with me because I'm going to be staying at your house. That condition was seen as very supportive to each of the planets where they exchanged homes. And that was seen as like being a planet being in its own sign. So we have some interesting things happening even right now in the world where normally Jupiter would be uncomfortable in Gemini and Mercury would be very uncomfortable in Pisces. But we now have a condition of mutual reception, which means Mercury and Jupiter are helping one another. See how that guest host thing comes back to play? And now we're integrating themes around understanding when a planet's comfortable versus not comfortable. Okay, let's keep going. Lastly, we come to the sign of Venus and Mars. Now, this is one that needs less explanation. How many of us heard of the book Women Are Like Venus and Men Are Like Mars? There are examples all over in the world that we can find of where there is clash around masculine and feminine energies. Well, we have that archetypal tension right here with Venus and Mars. We see this opposition conceptually in humanity in things like love and war, together and separate, rest and hard work, um, pleasantness, politeness, and niceties versus rudeness, uncouth behavior, abrasiveness, arrogance. These are the ways that Mars and Venus are different from one another. Now, to be fair, Mars isn't just all these negative, bad behaviors, but he is a malefic planet. But from Mars, we also get things like hard work, diligence, strategy, competition. Venus doesn't love competition. She wants harmony. She wants everybody to win. She wants there to not be friction where there's competition and heat. She wants things to be peaceable and relaxed, and she wants things to be friendly and popular and fun and pleasant. And Mars is like, I want to work hard. I want to do things by myself sometimes. I want to win. And you're too busy being friends with everybody. I want to win. I'm on a mission. I have somewhere to go. So there are characteristics that we associate with Mars that are driving, where Venus is more resting. Venus is more recreational. Mars is like, let's get down to business. Venus's base nature, like I said, was understood to be harmonious, considerate, deferential, always thinking about other people, peaceable. Venus loves peace. It's one of the reasons she rules Libra, the sign of diplomacy, considering two sides. You see that deferential quality. Venus loves beauty. She loves art. She's generous, kind, nurturing. One of the things that ancient astrologers equated with Venus was that she was cool and moist. Think about the time of year that Venus rules. She rules the springtime. What happens in spring? Seeds come to life. There's a growing warmth, and there's also a cool moistness in the earth. That moisture allows seeds to break open and to bring forth life. That cool, moist quality was associated with Venus. Venus cares about unity. and reconciliation and forgiveness. Mars, on the other hand, was considered to be hard, assertive, argumentative sometimes, independent, less concerned about what's good for everybody else, and more self-concerned. Competitive, I want to win. Dividing, whereas Venus likes to unify, Mars likes to divide. Mars was considered withering, full of heat and dryness. If we think about the heat of Aries, when the sun is starting to blaze at the time of the spring equinox and those first waves of warmth come in, or even in October, where, like, I think of times like the Pacific Northwest, where we might have a little bit of coolness in the morning, but you can still have some pretty warm days. And oftentimes it's even before we start seeing the first rains. It can be a very dry time. So Mars was known as a dry, hot planet. So when you don't have enough moisture, what happens? There withering occurs. What happens when you don't water a house plant and it starts to suffer? It's withering because it doesn't get moisture, but it might be getting warm, dry air, right? Similarly, Mars was warm and dry. Mars was responsible for cutting and severing, and Mars was courageous and fierce. This is why when we have Venus in a Mars sign, she is uncomfortable. She feels far away from home. And when Mars is in one of Venus's signs, Mars feels very different than his normal self. And so that begins to help us think about how planets behave differently in other signs. Okay. Here is where we start to learn some of the same information playing out, but now with the 4 classical aspects. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this, and then we'll be at Q&A here shortly. But one of the things that people don't always realize is that the Thema Mundi provides us the context for understanding the secrets behind the 4 classical aspects in astrology: the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition. These aspects weren't only mathematical, but they related actually to the planets and their signs and their position to the luminaries. Additionally, each of the aspects incorporated things related to the compatibility of the 4 elements: air, fire, earth, and water. Let's take a look. So each of the classical aspects, like I mentioned, is related to one of the planets. The sextile is of the nature of Venus. It's a complementary, harmonious, supportive aspect. The square was of the nature of Mars. It was considered challenging, difficult to overcome, but potentially productive. What does Mars represent? Hard work, sometimes a challenge or a clash, maybe some conflict, but it's productive. Mars likes to work hard. And so there's something about the square that offers us a challenge, but that challenge, if it's overcome, can actually work for our benefit. That's inherent in the square aspect. The trine was of the nature of Jupiter. It was positive, aligned, very supportive, and very constructive. The opposition, well, where do we get that? Remember, who sits opposite the luminaries? Well, it's our old friend Saturn. Saturn represents a stalemate, 2 polarities. There's great difficulty when there's an opposition. It makes it hard to reconcile things that are very, very different from one another, either 2 opposing natures or 2 oppositional perspectives. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So if we look at Venus and the sextile, we understand that it's complementary. The signs of Venus were 60 degrees away from the sun and the moon. So we can see that Libra was 2 signs away from the sun, and Taurus was 2 signs away from Cancer, the sign of the moon. The sextile, therefore, represents a complementary quality of 2 unlike things. Here we have water and earth, 2 different elements. We have fire, the sign of the sun, and air, Libra's, Venus's air sign. So here we have 2 unlike things that share the same gender. Water is feminine, earth is feminine. Air and fire are both masculine. So we think about this way in natural terms. We water the earth, and what happens? Growth, right? We give fire oxygen and air, and what does fire do? It grows. Fire heats up air and makes it move faster. Earth gives water a boundary and holds it. So we think about these qualities as being complementary to one another. This embodies Venus's nature. Things that are unlike coming together and supporting one another. That's where we get the nature of the sextile. And so when you see planets in a sextile relationship in your chart, you can think, oh, this is like Venusian. This is like harmonious. It's happy and complementary and partnering together, and 2 people who are different going, yeah, we're going to support each other through this. In astrology, earth and water were both feminine elements, or yin. They are receptive and receiving, passive energies. While they are fundamentally different elements, they complement one another because they share that yin nature. Air and fire are both masculine and yang. They are assertive, expressive. They are acting type energies. And while they are fundamentally different, they complement and support one another through that sharing of the gender energy. Mars is, like we talked about, the square. A square is any aspect that's at a 90-degree angle. So we get the nature of the square because the signs of Mars were 90 degrees or 3 signs away from the moon and the sun. This is why I love the Thema Mundi. It makes it so simple, you guys. It's just mind-blowing how foundational this concept is. Each sign is 30 degrees, so 30, 60, 90. We have the moon in a 90-degree angle from Cancer to Aries. We have the sun at a 90-degree angle to the sign of Scorpio from Leo. Now, this pattern repeats between other signs, right? Well, that's because the square, like I mentioned, represents a challenge that needs to be overcome. It's an aspect between 2 opposite elements and 2 opposite genders. So we have fire and water with the sun, or with the moon and Mars. We have masculine energy in Aries. We have feminine energy in Cancer. Sorry, it took me a minute there for my mouth to catch up to my brain. Um, Similarly, we have the sun in a fire sign here in Leo, and we have Mars in a water sign. Fire and water, masculine and feminine. Now that can repeat with other signs as well. So let's take Libra. Libra is an air sign that is masculine. If we go 90 degrees, we see water, and we see a feminine sign of the moon. Water and air do not quite reconcile very well. Why is that? Air is more logical, rational. It's going to be more objective. The moon, water, is more emotional, more subjective. That's where we see these conflicts. Can they work together. Yes, but it takes some doing. That's the nature of a square. The square does, however, share one commonality, even though it's opposite elements and opposite genders. It shares the dynamic of being either cardinal or tropical, as it's referred to sometimes, fixed or mutable. These are three different types of energies that relate to the beginning, the middle, or the end of a season. If we think about cardinal is initiating energy, like a new season that is launching and picking up. There were 4 cardinal signs. We have Cancer, the beginning of summer, Aries, the beginning of spring, Capricorn, the beginning of winter, and Libra, the beginning of fall. Fixed signs were the middle of a season or where the energy of that season is held. The 4 fixed signs were Leo, the fixed energy of summer, Taurus, the fixed energy of spring, Aquarius, the fixed energy of winter, and Scorpio, the fixed energy of fall. The mutable signs, or double-bodied, means that they were of 2 natures, partly initiating and partly fixed. Those were the signs of Virgo, which is the time of year where we're holding on to that energy of summer, and then all of a sudden there's this push and this shift into fall. We have the sign of Gemini, which is we're holding on to that spring energy, and all of a sudden we're pushing right into the summer energy with the solstice. Same thing with Pisces. We're holding on to the energy of winter, and then all of a sudden we're pushing into spring. Sagittarius is we're holding on to that fall, that beautiful fall energy and the dwindling of the light, and then all of a sudden we're pushing into winter. That's a double-bodied energy, what it means to have 2 natures. So each of these have squares to other signs. But what's unique about that is they share the same modality of energy. So when we have a Cancer Aries square, they are both initiating. So they find that commonality that they're working to initiate the same way, but they're coming at it from different elements, different genders. Similarly, with a mutable sign like Sagittarius, it's that double-bodied energy of holding and then initiating, and it's square to like this sign in Scorpio. They share that holding, initiating energy. I'm sorry, not Scorpio, Virgo. They share that holding and initiating energy, but otherwise they are different in element and gender. So hopefully that helps to understand why there is some point of common ground here with that makes the square potential to be productive. One of the next ones we have is the trine, which is the nature of Jupiter. And trines occur at 120 degrees of the signs of the luminaries. So 4 signs away. So we have the moon in Cancer. Jupiter rules Pisces, another water sign. Feminine, water, same element. The sun, we go 4 signs away from the sun, and we find Sagittarius. That's where we get the nature of the trine. The trine combines the quality of the same element and the same gender. Because of this, the trine was known as one of the most powerful positive aspects. It was seen as superior. And if you think about it, think about a friend maybe that you've had in your life where you guys liked the same things, you enjoyed the same activities. There was such a common spirit between the two of you where everything was easier. That was like the energy of a trine. It wasn't like you were having to express energy and being complementary to one another. More like a sextile relationship where there's differences, but you can find a way to work together. This is like where there's the same energy, it's like bosom buddies. This is trines, the nature trines. It's easy, it's supportive, it's powerfully constructive. They share the same element and gender, and because of that, we have an understanding that these represent elemental triads. So the three water signs are Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. There is an ease with which these water signs support each other. Then we go to the air signs, Libra, Gemini, and Aquarius. Earth signs, Virgo, Taurus, and Capricorn. Fire, Leo, Aries, and Sagittarius. Like I said, the trines for this reason were considered to be the most positive aspect because of that power of alignment between the elements and the gender of the signs. Lastly, we get to talk about our friend Saturn again. And here we have the nature of the opposition because of the lights, the sun and the moon opposing the darkness in Capricorn and Aquarius. The opposition represents two polarities, a stalemate where there's equal and opposite forces at work. It represents great difficulty and oftentimes where there's no progress that can be made, where that stalemate doesn't allow either side to really move because of that opposite nature or perspective. The signs of Saturn, therefore, were 180 degrees away from the sun and the moon. So Capricorn sits at 180 degrees of Cancer, and Aquarius sits at 180 degrees of the sun. This is where we derive the nature of the opposition. They represent stalemates because they're representing the same quality of energy, cardinal, fixed, or mutable. So we have the moon in a cardinal water sign, and we have Saturn in a cardinal earth sign. There is the same quality of energy being expressed, both initiating. They also have the same gender, feminine water, feminine earth. This is why oppositions were considered as adversarial or even rivalry. So think about a time when you can think about somebody that was of the same gender, but like the exact opposite of you, and you felt that adversarial quality or almost like a rivalry. Like there was that quality of trying to one up one another. That's the quality of an opposition. You know, they do have complementary elements. And so that's what's interesting about opposition is it's almost like you should be able to work together, but because of that opposition of perspective and bringing that same energy, there's this clash. And that's why Cancer was the opposite of Capricorn, and Leo was the opposite of Aquarius. It's why the moon was in exile in Saturn's territory, and the sun was in exile in Aquarius, and Saturn was in exile in either one of these signs. So, in summary, the Thema Mundi helps anchor us in some very practical ways of thinking that define some of the basic components and concepts in astrology, specifically the planets in the signs that they rule. And remember, this is where we start, but if you think about the sun chasing each of the planets to their other domiciles, we get that understanding of the two signs and how all of the other planets rule a masculine sign and a feminine sign. We get a basic understanding of when a planet has good dignity or good comfort, good access to its home resources, or if it's the guest of another planet. And then we have a little bit of an idea of how comfortable that planet might be based on is it in a sign that is contrary to its nature when we think about planetary contrarieties. And as a reminder, those contrarieties like Venus and Mars, Mercury and Jupiter, Saturn and the lights, these have to do with those planets being outside of their comfort zone, and far away from home. And we also have the basic definitions of the four classical aspects. Pretty amazing. It's one of the reasons why I love this tool. It's one of the reasons why I love it too, because it allows us to pull in some of the astronomical and seasonal imagery, and it just reminds me again of how harmonious this system and this sacred art of astrology is tied in with nature. And I think sometimes we don't always connect to that or realize all the ways that there's an interconnectedness between the planets and the signs that they rule and the times of year. It's just magical to me that all of this is kind of embedded here in this wonderful teaching tool called the Thema Mundi. All right. So that concludes our class today, and I want to thank you so much for joining. We're going to go ahead and transition to the Q&A now, and that part of our time will not be recorded. So if you have questions about any of the material that I presented today and you are watching this video at a later time, please email me. There is ways that you can contact me through my website, WisdomTreeAstrology.com. My email is here, Sean@WisdomTreeAstrology.com. And if you are interested in being a member of my Patreon, there is the website for my Patreon where you can subscribe and get regular posts and supports for your spiritual journey that integrate astrology, tarot, crystal healing, spirituality, ancestor work, dream work. Like there's so many tools that we have that we can access to support us in our spiritual journeys. And I am passionate about empowering people. And if you think that that's something that you would like or enjoy, please check out my Patreon. All right, I am going to end this recording. Please feel free to contact me if you have questions after class, and we will have some Q&A.